Intro. I didn't recognize the envelope at first. White, embossed edges, weightier than ordinary mail. It sat on the corner of my kitchen table for almost an hour, untouched as if it carried a truth I wasn't ready to claim. My name in careful script stared back at me, Colonel Evelyn Hayes. Not Evelyn, not Evie, not sister, not daughter. Just the rank that had become easier for people to use than my given name. Inside, though I hadn't yet torn the seal, I already knew what waited. Whispers reach you in strange ways when you've served long enough. Half-forgotten emails, a stray comment on social media, a message forwarded by a friend of a friend. Clara was getting married. No, not Clara. My brother's fiancée, my former comrade. The woman I once carried from the heat of battle when shrapnel tore through the dust of Kandahar. And Daniel, my little brother, the one who used to follow me through the woods behind our house with scraped knees and endless questions, was the groom. My fingers tightened around the envelope until the edges bent. 6 years had passed since I'd heard my mother's voice outside of polite seasonal cards. Birthdays came and went without a call. Deployments ended without welcome home hugs. When my hearing was nearly lost to a roadside blast, not even a get-well note arrived. And now this, an invitation so elegant it felt like a command. The word, family, twisted into obligation. Before I tell you more, let me pause here. Because what you're about to hear isn't just my story. It's a story about silence, about scars invisible to the naked eye, about what it costs when the people who should know you best choose not to see you at all. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or quietly erased, then you'll understand the pulse of what's coming. And before we step deeper into this memory together, I'd love for you to take one small action. Hit the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Not because numbers matter to me, but because voices like mine, voices of veterans, especially women, get lost in the noise. Your support makes sure these stories, these truths, are not silenced again. Tell me in the comments if you've ever been overlooked by people who should have known better. I promise, you're not alone. Now back to that envelope. I broke the seal slowly, as if time could stall the sting. The card inside smelled faintly of ink and pressed paper, too fine for our family's humble roots. Daniel Hayes and Clara James request the honor of your presence. My throat tightened. Clara James, once a lieutenant, once under my command. Once a name I screamed into the chaos of gunfire, praying she'd hold on until the medevac arrived. My brother knew. He had to know. The irony cut deeper than any open insult. My family had never called me disgrace outright. They didn't need to. Their weapon of choice was quieter, omission. I wasn't in the family photos anymore. My name slipped from conversation like an old mistake no one wanted to revisit. At Dad's funeral, I stood in the back in uniform, while Mom filled the front row with cousins and neighbors. I wasn't told where to sit. I wasn't told anything at all. Just a hand on my arm after the service, her voice a whisper sharp as glass. You shouldn't have worn the uniform. It makes it seem like you're trying to upstage us. That was the last real sentence we exchanged. Until now. The envelope lay open on my table, its words bleeding into the air around me. Behave. The note from Mom clipped to the corner in her precise handwriting. Not we miss you. Not come home. Just one word, a command masquerading as care. Behave. As if the problem had always been me, not the silence that carved me out of their lives. I leaned back in my chair, the kitchen clock ticking too loudly. Outside the window, the street lamps cast their orange glow over parked cars and cracked pavement. It was an ordinary night in an ordinary neighborhood, but the weight pressing against my chest was anything but ordinary. Because this invitation wasn't just to a wedding, it was to a reckoning. I poured myself a glass of water, though my hands trembled enough to splash half of it onto the counter. My thoughts spun back to Clara. The last time I saw her, we were both covered in dirt and blood. She was half-conscious, whispering through cracked lips, "Don't leave me." I hadn't. I dragged her through fire and smoke, my shoulder torn open, lungs burning with the acrid taste of war. We never spoke about it afterward. She recovered. I carried the scar. Now she was marrying my brother. The past slammed against the present so hard it almost winded me. Could Daniel truly not see the shadow this cast? Or maybe he saw and chose to step into it anyway. Maybe love made him blind, or maybe it made him complicit. I thought of my years overseas, the faces of soldiers I led, the funerals I attended. In those dusty deserts and broken towns, I belonged. I had a purpose. But here, in the quiet of my own kitchen, staring at the proof that my family was moving on without me, I felt like a ghost haunting my own bloodline. I tried to remember the last time we were all together without tension. Maybe Daniel's high school graduation, long before I enlisted. He'd hugged me then, proud, even though Mom's smile was tight. Or maybe before that, when Dad still coached his little league games and I cheered from the stands in uniform fresh from Rotk. Back then, I thought the uniform would make them proud. Instead, it built a wall I couldn't tear down. The irony. On the battlefield, I learned to breach barriers, dismantle blockades, move through enemy fire. But I couldn't scale the silence at my own dinner table. The phone sat on the counter. I stared at it, debating whether to call Daniel, to demand answers, to scream, to plead, to beg him to explain why Clara, of all people. But the phone stayed silent, and so did I. Silence had become my armor. But that night, alone with the invitation, I realized armor wasn't always enough. Sometimes, the only way to face old wounds is to walk back into the fire that created them. I folded the invitation neatly, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it into the pocket of my jacket. My reflection in the kitchen window was tired, shoulders sagging beneath years of service and solitude. Yet my eyes still held something steady. Tomorrow, I would book a flight, not because I expected welcome, not because I believed in sudden reconciliation, but because some stories demand to be lived all the way through, no matter how jagged their edges. And so the wound reopened, and I prepared to walk back into the family that had taught me silence, and perhaps finally, to let them see what silence had made of me. The airport smelled of old coffee and floor wax. People rushed past with their roller bags, their chatter and laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, and for a moment I wondered if I was the only one carrying a storm inside. I wore civilian clothes, but the weight on my shoulders felt heavier than any uniform. The ticket in my pocket wasn't just a boarding pass, it was a summons to face ghosts that had never stopped haunting me. The flight itself passed in silence. I sat by the window, staring out over endless clouds, my reflection faint in the glass. My mind circled back to childhood summers, to Daniel chasing fireflies in the yard while I played the role of his protector. Back then, I thought loyalty was simple. You stood by family. You stood by truth. But what happens when those two things no longer walk side by side? That question has chased me longer than any enemy fire. Landing felt like stepping into another world. The town hadn't changed. The same cracked sidewalks, the same maple trees arching over Main Street, the same bakery where Mom used to buy lemon bars. But time had changed me, and the distance between who I was and who they believed me to be yawned wider than any desert canyon. The house loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac, its white paint now chipped, the porch sagging slightly. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like a stage where an old play would repeat itself, each character sticking to their lines. My mother opened the door before I knocked, her smile stretched too thin, her pearl earrings gleaming. "Evelyn," she said, not warmly, not coldly, just flat, like she was acknowledging a neighbor who had dropped by uninvited. Inside, the air smelled of polish and pot roast. The table was already set for dinner, places marked with folded napkins. My name card rested far at the end, beside the kitchen doorway, half-shadowed as if the lamp above hadn't bothered to reach me. That's how it always was, present but peripheral. Relatives trickled in, coats shrugged off, voices filling the room. Some greeted me with polite surprise, others with carefully measured nods. I heard the first comment before I even sat down. "So, Evelyn, still guarding doors, are you?" The words floated on a laugh that wasn't quite cruel, but wasn't kind either. It was the sort of remark people use when they want to diminish you without getting their hands dirty. I smiled politely, said nothing. Silence can be sharper than retort, but inside I felt the familiar sting. People think combat teaches you how to fight. In truth, it teaches you how to hold still, how to let the firestorm pass through without letting it burn you alive. That night I chose silence as my shield. Another relative chimed in later, swirling wine in her glass. "I hear the military has all sorts of jobs these days. Not everyone has to be on the front lines, right?" Her tone was light, but the implication clear. To them, my rank wasn't heroism, it was convenience, an excuse to downplay what they couldn't understand. As I sat at that long table, their chatter brushing past me like I wasn't even there, another memory rose unbidden. A different return home, a different kind of silence. I thought of the day I stepped off the plane after my second deployment. The terminal smelled of jet fuel and fried food, the kind of ordinary scent that feels obscene after months of dust and blood. Families rushed forward with balloons, flags, flowers. Children squealed and wrapped themselves around fathers still smelling of sand and sweat. Wives kissed husbands as though they could stop time with the press of their lips. And me? I walked through the gate alone, no one waiting, no hand-painted sign with my name, no arms pulling me close. I remember scanning the crowd, searching for even a familiar face and finding none. The ache in my chest then was sharp, but I buried it, just as I buried so many things. I picked up my duffel, squared my shoulders, and walked out into a parking lot full of other people's reunions. Do you know that kind of silence? The silence of being forgotten in the very moment you most needed to be remembered. Tell me if you do, because I think too many of us carry that ache without ever speaking it aloud. On the battlefield, respect had never been in question. My soldiers knew me. They trusted me with their lives. When I gave an order, they followed, not because of the stripes on my shoulder, but because they believed in me. They saw me. Out there, amid the roar of helicopters and the thunder of mortars, I was never invisible. I was necessary. And now, here, sitting at the end of my mother's table, I was erased with a polite smile and a joke about guarding doors. The whiplash of it struck harder than enemy fire. Why was I a hero abroad but invisible at home? That question sat heavy in my chest as laughter filled the dining room. I watched Daniel answer questions about his honeymoon, about Clara's promotion. My name stayed unspoken, like an afterthought too heavy for polite conversation. I chewed slowly, swallowed carefully, and let the silence settle around me like armor. Do you know that feeling? Sitting in a room full of people who claim to know you, yet none of them truly see you. That's what it felt like being erased, not with anger, but with dismissal. Tell me if you've ever been in that room, where your truth was too heavy for others to carry, so they chose to set it down and pretend it didn't exist. Dinner passed in fragments. Forks clinked against plates, conversations hummed around me, but I was an island at the edge of the table. My mother asked Daniel about honeymoon plans, about Clara's new job at the firm, about the weather. My name was never spoken. When I finally tried to share a small story, something about the bakery I'd seen downtown, my words fell into silence, the kind where no one looks up, no one answers, and then conversation resumes as though you hadn't spoken at all. I leaned back in my chair, spine straight, eyes steady. I wouldn't beg for recognition. I wouldn't claw my way into their comfort. My strength, I reminded myself, was not in my words but in my restraint. Sometimes dignity means refusing to compete with the noise. And yet, beneath the calm surface, old memories stirred. Nights overseas when I lay awake listening to the distant rumble of mortars. Days when I carried men and women broken by blasts, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. I thought of Clara's weight against my shoulder, her breath shallow, her fingers clutching mine as I pulled her from rubble. Did she remember? Did she ever tell my brother the truth of that night? Or had my family decided even that story belonged to silence? After dinner, I slipped outside for air. The night was cool, the stars sharp above the treetops. I leaned against the porch railing, letting the quiet steady me. Inside, laughter swelled, easy, careless, untouched by the scars that had marked me forever. I wondered then, was I wrong to come back? Was walking into this house just another battle where the enemy was invisibility? But here's the hook, the thought that kept me standing there. Sometimes you don't return to change people. Sometimes you return to change yourself, to prove that their silence doesn't erase your presence. Have you ever done that? Walked back into a room not because you expected to be welcomed, but because you refused to vanish. That night, in the small bedroom that used to be mine, I unpacked my bag slowly. The posters of childhood were gone, replaced with neutral paint, as though erasing me had required repainting the walls. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the old house. My chest ached, but my resolve held firm. Tomorrow would bring more tests, wedding rehearsals, family gatherings, moments designed to remind me of my place. But I would not bend. And let me pause here to ask you something. If you were me, if your family placed you at the far end of the table, erased your stories with polite silence, would you fight to be heard, or would you hold your silence like a sword? Share your thoughts. Because sometimes the line between dignity and defeat is razor thin, and I wonder how others carry that choice. Sleep finally came, but it was restless, scattered with dreams of sand and fire, of voices calling through the smoke. When morning light slipped through the curtains, I rose, dressed, and braced myself for another round. The wedding was 2 days away, but already the weight of it pressed down. What they didn't know, what they could never know, was that I carried more than silence. I carried truth. And truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising when the moment demands it. The morning after that first dinner came gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed low over the town as though even the heavens wanted to shrink me down. I rose early, out of habit more than need, lacing my shoes before the house stirred. The air smelled faintly of coffee and dust. It should have smelled like home, but it didn't. As I walked down the hall, I passed framed photographs. Daniel in his baseball uniform, Mom and Dad at their anniversary party, cousins lined up at graduations. None of me. It wasn't that they'd removed my pictures. They'd never put them up in the first place. It hit me then that omission wasn't just about forgetting. It was about rewriting the story of who belonged here. Do you know that feeling, when you see evidence of your own erasure not in words, but in absence? It's like standing at a family portrait session and realizing the photographer never called your name. That ache settles deeper than anger. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt invisible in a room where your name should have mattered? I went outside for air, the porch creaking under my weight. My gaze drifted across the yard where Daniel and I once played. I could almost hear his boyish laughter, the way he'd insist I play catcher while he practiced pitching. Back then, he followed me everywhere, his trust absolute. "You're my hero," he'd once whispered when I fixed his bike chain. That memory felt like a foreign language now, something spoken long ago but forgotten by everyone except me. The day wore on with rehearsals. Chairs arranged in rows, flowers tested, the pastor rehearsing vows. Clara walked down the aisle in a simple dress, her steps confident, her voice crisp as she discussed timing with the planner. Our eyes met only once, and in that moment, I wondered if she remembered the desert night when blood soaked her uniform and my arms were the only thing keeping her tethered to life. That flashback hit hard. I could feel the heat of the explosion again, the sharp crack of gunfire rattling the air. Dust filled my lungs as I crawled toward her. She was pinned under debris, her leg mangled, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't leave me," she rasped, and I promised I wouldn't. I lifted, dragged, carried her weight across burning sand, every muscle screaming, every breath a prayer. "Stay with me, Clara. Stay with me." The medevac came minutes later, blades churning the night sky, but in those moments I was all she had. And now here she was, bride-to-be, polished and composed, greeting family with practiced ease, her survival story erased as neatly as my presence at the table. Did she ever tell Daniel the truth? Did she ever say his sister had saved her life? Or was that chapter sealed away, too inconvenient to fit their storybook wedding? At the rehearsal dinner that evening, the room buzzed with chatter. Plates clattered, glasses clinked, candles flickered in polished holders. I took my seat, again at the far end, watching as conversation flowed around me like a current I wasn't meant to join. "Evelyn," a relative said lightly, cutting into her chicken. "Must be nice not having to worry about mortgages and soccer practice. Military life looks simple in that way." Her tone wasn't cruel, but the dismissal burned. Simple, as if carrying comrades dying in my arms had been a holiday. Another voice chimed in. "I saw an article about women in uniform. Most of them don't see combat, right?" Laughter followed, soft but sharp. I kept my back straight, my expression calm. I didn't argue, I didn't defend. Combat had taught me that not every fight is worth words. Sometimes silence roars louder than protest. But Daniel, he noticed. Across the table, his eyes flicked to mine, quick but steady. He gave the smallest shake of his head, as though to say he saw what was happening, even if he couldn't stop it. Later, when dessert was served, he slipped a piece of lemon pie onto my plate without a word. It was small, almost invisible to others, but to me, it felt like a memory of the boy who once whispered, "You're my hero." That night in the guest room, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of laughter from downstairs. My chest ached with the weight of what had been lost. I thought of Dad, of the way he used to tell me I was strong, how his voice was the last tether before silence swallowed me whole. I thought of Mom's note clipped to the invitation, "Behave." Behave meant don't remind us of who you are. Behave meant stay small. But here's the thing, small is not who I am. I turned onto my side, remembering another flashback, the day Clara returned to the unit after recovery. She avoided my gaze, her gratitude buried under pride. We never spoke about that night again. But I carried it every step, every scar, every nightmare. And now, watching her slip so easily into the role of bride, beloved by the very family who had cut me out, I felt the sting of betrayal more piercing than any bullet. Do you think forgiveness is possible when betrayal comes not from strangers, but from those you once carried on your back? I wonder about that every day. Share your thoughts, because I know I'm not the only one wrestling with that question. The wedding day crept closer, rehearsals blurring into dinners into awkward silences. Each evening ended the same, me in that guest room, wide awake, rehearsing words I'd never say. Words like, "You owe me the truth," "You owe me recognition." But morning always came, and silence always won. And yet, through it all, I stood tall. That was my quiet rebellion. To endure without begging, to sit at the far end of the table with dignity unbroken. Because sometimes strength isn't raising your voice, it's refusing to let theirs diminish you. I'll stop here with one more thought. If you've been listening and this story resonates, if you've ever chosen silence over shouting because you knew your worth didn't need their validation, make sure to subscribe. Stay with me. Because what's coming next, The moment when everything shifts is something you won't want to miss. The morning of the wedding broke with a sky too bright for the weight I carried. Sunlight spilled across the curtains in the small guest room, but it felt more like interrogation than blessing. I rose, brushed my uniform one last time, even though I had promised myself I would wear a simple dress. At the last moment, I couldn't. The uniform wasn't just clothes. It was my spine, my voice when words failed, my only proof in a world eager to forget. Walking downstairs, I caught the look in my mother's eyes when she saw me in uniform. Not rage, not pride, just that thin, brittle smile that meant behave. She didn't have to say the word again, it hung between us like smoke. The church glowed with soft light. Candles lined the aisle, flowers overflowed from crystal vases, violins sang from the loft. Guests settled into pews, voices hushed, anticipation thick. I took my seat near the back, of course, where the ushers directed me without hesitation, as though they had been told exactly how far from the altar I should sit. Have you ever felt that? The weight of being deliberately placed on the edges of a moment, when your whole life told you that you belonged at the center. Share that if you know it, because sometimes the loneliest seat in the room is the one chosen for you, not by you. Clara floated down the aisle in her gown, radiant and unshaken. Daniel's eyes lit with love as she reached him. For a brief second, I allowed myself to feel something almost like peace, remembering the boy who once clung to my hand crossing the street. He looked older now, stronger, but part of me could still see the freckles across his nose, the boy who whispered I was his hero. The vows were spoken, rings exchanged, lips pressed in promise. The congregation cheered, hands clapping, the air thick with joy. I clapped too, though softly, my palms against each other muted, as though clapping could disguise the ache in my chest. Then came the reception, the true stage for unspoken battles. Tables shimmered with glassware and folded napkins. Champagne bubbled in tall flutes. The air buzzed with chatter, laughter, the clink of forks. I found my seat again at the periphery near the service doors. People passed by without lingering, their eyes sliding past me the way you look past a painting hung too low on the wall. Dinner began. Toasts followed. Daniel's friends spoke of his loyalty, his charm. Clara's colleagues praised her ambition, her wit. My mother took the microphone, voice steady, thanking guests for sharing this perfect day. My name never crossed her lips. Then Clara stood. Her voice rang with practiced sweetness. She thanked her parents, her bridesmaids, her colleagues, even distant relatives flown in from far states. She thanked the town priest, the florist, the baker. She laughed, teased Daniel gently, her charisma drawing easy smiles. But my name, once again, was not spoken. Not once. The omission sliced deeper than words could. To erase me was one thing. To erase me here, in this room filled with faces who knew, who had seen my years in uniform, who had read my rank in print, was something else entirely. It was a public burial of my presence. Have you ever been erased so loudly that the silence around your name roared louder than applause? That's what it felt like. Tell me if you've lived that, because it carves scars no one else can see. I sat still, my spine straight, my face calm. Inside, my pulse thundered, memories flashing, dust storms, the sound of helicopters, Clara's blood on my hands. The dissonance nearly stole my breath. Then Daniel rose. He didn't take the microphone. He didn't ask permission. He simply pushed back his chair, the scrape against the polished floor cutting through the chatter. Guests turned, puzzled. Clara's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. My mother stiffened in her seat, pearls catching the light. Daniel walked across the room, steady, measured. He stopped in front of me. For a moment, the world shrank to just the two of us, the sister who raised him, the boy who once looked at me like I was unbreakable. His eyes held mine, full of something I couldn't name, sorrow, pride, apology, love. And then before everyone, he straightened his spine, lifted his hand, and delivered a soldier's salute. Crisp, sharp, Absolute. "This," he said, voice clear, carrying across the hall, "is Colonel Evelyn Hayes, my sister, my hero." The words slammed into the silence like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air seemed to still, the chandeliers frozen, glasses suspended. And then it happened, slow, powerful. A man at the next table rose, his posture military. Another followed. One by one, veterans scattered through the crowd stood, hands lifting in salute. The room transformed. Where silence had once erased me, recognition now resurrected me. My eyes burned, but I didn't bow my head. I returned Daniel's salute, slow and steady, every muscle alive with decades of unspoken truth. Have you ever had a moment when the world finally saw you, not just the surface, but the truth of who you are? That's what it felt like. If you've lived that moment, you know how it steals your breath and sets you free all at once. Share that story if you have it, I promise. Someone else needs to hear it. Clara's face was pale, her hands clutching the microphone she had forgotten to lower. My mother's lips pressed tight, her silence now the silence of someone who had lost control of the story she tried to write. Around us, the applause began, not forced, but rising like a tide, a recognition that could not be silenced. I stood, not because I needed to prove anything, but because the moment demanded it. My voice, when I finally spoke, was soft but steady. "Thank you." That was all. No speech, no explanation. Just 2 words. Enough. The reception stumbled forward after that, but the air was different. Conversations hushed when I passed. Eyes that had once dismissed me now carried something else, respect, perhaps even regret. Daniel returned to Clara's side, but before he did, he pressed my shoulder with his hand, just for a second, as though to say, "I remember. I always remembered." That night, back in the guest room, I sat by the window long after the music faded. My chest ached with something new, not just sorrow, but release. For years, silence had been my cage. Tonight, Daniel had cracked it open with a single salute. And here's the truth I want you to carry. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it doesn't come in apologies or reconciliations. Sometimes it arrives in a single gesture, a word spoken in front of those who tried to silence you. Sometimes justice is simply being seen. If you're still here listening, if this moment has gripped you, let me ask you, who in your life has quietly stood for you when no one else would? Share their name, their story. Let this comment section be a place where silence is broken and recognition rises. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Stay with me. Because these stories aren't just mine, they belong to every soldier, every sister, every forgotten voice that deserves to be heard. Clara finally lowered the microphone, though her hands shook as she set it on the table. Her face was frozen in a smile too bright, the kind of smile that hides panic. She glanced at Daniel, perhaps expecting him to sit back down and smooth the moment away, to fold me neatly back into silence. But Daniel didn't. He lingered a second longer by my side, the salute still echoing in the air before walking back to her. The applause didn't fade quickly. It rolled across the room in waves, tentative at first, then louder, then steady, until it filled the hall with something undeniable. People looked at me differently now. Some nodded, some clapped with both hands, others simply stared, as though trying to reconcile the woman at the far end of the table with the title colonel. The very uniform they had once treated as distraction was suddenly the proof they could no longer ignore. And my mother, oh my mother, she didn't clap. She sat rigid, her pearls catching the light like tiny mirrors. Her lips pressed thin, her gaze fixed on her wine glass. She didn't look at me, not once. To acknowledge me now would have been to admit all the years of erasure had been a mistake. Her silence screamed louder than applause. Have you ever been caught in that in-between space, where strangers honor you but the people you needed most refuse to? That is its own kind of battlefield. And I wonder, if you were sitting in that hall, would you feel victorious or hollow? After the speeches stumbled on, conversation shifted into awkward fragments. A few guests approached me with polite gratitude, the kind you offer when you don't quite know what else to say. One man, a veteran with lines carved deep across his face, grasped my hand and said simply, "We see you." That was enough. Clara tried to resume her charm. She laughed louder, gestured with flourish, pulled Daniel into a kiss mid-conversation. But the shine of her words had dulled. The guests' attention had already shifted. The true story of the night had been rewritten in those 3 sentences. "This is Colonel Evelyn Hayes, my sister, my hero." When dessert was served, I felt eyes on me constantly. Whispers slipped through the air like threads. "She's the sister. She served overseas." A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years approached timidly. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, as if my silence had been the problem, not their refusal to listen. I didn't answer. Sometimes the truth doesn't need words. It sits heavy in the air, undeniable. Later, as dancing began, Daniel slipped away from the crowd and found me near the exit doors. The music pulsed faintly through the walls, Clara twirling in the center of the floor. Daniel's tie was loosened, his cheeks flushed, but his eyes were clear. "I couldn't let them forget," he whispered. "Not you, not what you've done." I searched his face, that boy I'd carried through childhood now standing as a man. "Thank you," I said, my voice low, steady, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of decades. He gripped my hand briefly, a squeeze filled with apology and pride, then turned back to the crowd, back to the life he had chosen. I stayed by the wall, watching. The night spun on, laughter and dancing layered over the wound that had just been torn open. I felt both exposed and vindicated. For years, silence had defined me. Now silence was impossible. When I returned to the guest room that night, the echoes of applause still lingered in my ears. I sat by the window, staring at the moonlight stretched across the lawn, and I let myself breathe in the weight of what had happened. My brother had given me back my name, not Evelyn, not Evie, but Colonel. My title, my life's work, my scars and sacrifices, all spoken aloud in a room that had tried to erase me. And yet my heart ached. Because though Daniel had stood for me, my mother had not. Her silence had been absolute. And Clara, she had avoided my gaze all night, her smile brittle, her laughter hollow. Did she feel guilt? Did she remember that desert night, or had she built her life on forgetting? These questions kept me awake. Recognition is powerful, yes, but recognition from strangers does not heal the wound left by family's denial. I realized then that this story wasn't about winning their approval. It was about something larger. Do you feel that too? That even when others refuse to see you, the act of standing tall, of being named, is a victory in itself. Let me know, because sometimes just hearing that others have found their voice helps us hold onto our own. As dawn broke, the house was quiet again. The party was over, the flowers wilting in their vases, the air heavy with aftermath. I gathered my bag slowly, folding the uniform with care. I hadn't spoken much that night. I hadn't needed to. Daniel's salute had said more than I ever could. The music struck up again, a string quartet shifting into something light and lilting, but the air in the hall was no longer the same. The chandeliers still glowed, champagne still fizzed in flutes, but a ripple had moved through the room that no melody could soften. I could feel it in the way eyes lingered on me, in the way conversations bent and hushed whenever I passed. Clara tried to reclaim the spotlight. She laughed too loudly at a bridesmaid's joke, her hand clutching Daniel's arm a little too tightly, her smile stretched until it trembled. Once, across the room, our eyes met. For a flicker of a second, I saw it, the memory she couldn't bury. The desert heat, the blood pooling beneath her, my voice in her ear telling her to hold on. Her glass shook slightly in her hand before she looked away, directing her attention to a cluster of guests with forced enthusiasm. Have you ever seen someone fight to erase their own past, only to have it written back into their eyes? That's what I saw in Clara. Not malice, not even hatred. Just fear that the truth might surface in front of people who only knew the polished version of her story. Around me, whispers floated like threads. Did you hear what he said, Colonel? She served over there. I had no idea. Some voices carried awe, others disbelief, a few tinged with regret. My mother never joined them. She remained at her table, spine rigid, pearls catching the light. To clap now, to turn her head toward me, would be to admit she had been wrong for years, and she would not surrender that easily. A man in his 60s, jacket tight across his shoulders, approached me near the buffet. His walk was stiff, his eyes damp. Afghanistan, he asked quietly. I nodded. He gave a sharp salute, then simply said, "Welcome home." 2 words, decades overdue. My throat tightened, but I returned the salute. Later, a younger woman, one of Clara's colleagues, slipped to my side. "My father served," she whispered. "He never talked about it. Seeing your brother honor you, it matters, more than you know." Her eyes glistened before she hurried back into the crowd, as if saying it aloud risked too much. Each exchange was brief, almost secret, but together they built something undeniable. The tide had shifted. My existence, once ignored, was now stitched into the fabric of the evening. Not because I demanded it, but because truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. At the edge of the dance floor, Clara spun beneath Daniel's arm, her veil trailing like smoke. She smiled, she posed, she played the role. But every so often, her gaze darted toward me, as if afraid I might rise and tell the whole room what really bound us together. I didn't. I stayed silent, letting the weight of Daniel's words settle into every corner of the hall. Sometimes silence isn't erasure. Sometimes it's power. By the time the last song faded and the candles burned low, the guests had begun to seek me out more openly. A cousin pressed my hand and said, "I didn't know. I should have." Another, eyes lowered, murmured, "We're proud of you." Even if the words were late, even if they were offered only because Daniel had forced them into the open, they mattered. They carved space where none had been before. When I finally left the reception, the night air was cool against my face. Behind me, laughter and music still spilled from the hall, but I carried something different with me, an ache, yes, but also a spark. For the first time in years, I hadn't been erased, and that changed everything. But deep in my chest, a new resolve was forming. This moment, this unexpected recognition, wasn't the end. It was a beginning, because justice is not just about one gesture at one wedding. Justice is about what you do with it afterward. And that, I knew, would be the next chapter of my story. The morning after the wedding felt like stepping into the quiet after a storm. The house was hushed, the flowers drooping, the echoes of music still lingering faintly in the walls. I packed my bag slowly, folding my uniform with care, running my hand across the fabric as though it had absorbed every moment from the night before. My brother's salute, the room rising to honor me, the silence of my mother, all of it still pressed against my chest. But I didn't seek her out. I didn't knock on her bedroom door or wait at the kitchen table hoping for words that would never come. I didn't ask for apologies, and I didn't offer confrontation. That chapter was finished, whether she admitted it or not. I knew then that healing would not come from her. Healing would have to come from what I chose to build afterward. Have you ever reached that point? The moment you stop waiting for an apology and start writing your own closure. If you've lived that, you know it feels like standing at a cliff edge, terrified but also free. Share if you've ever chosen that kind of freedom. It matters more than you think. I boarded a flight back to my city, watching the patchwork fields slide beneath me, my reflection faint in the airplane window. People around me chatted about vacations and business trips, but I sat in silence, a plan forming quietly in my mind. I had carried the weight of erasure for too long. I had carried the stories of other soldiers, too, men and women whose families turned cold, who came home to empty living rooms, who swallowed their pain because no one wanted to hear it. The wedding had cracked something open. My brother's words had reminded me, silence doesn't erase truth. But truth means little if it stays locked inside one person. It had to be shared. It had to be used. That's where the Horizon Project was born, not in a boardroom, not on a piece of paper, but in that space between grief and resolve. I didn't want another veteran to sit alone in a kitchen with an invitation that cut deeper than combat wounds. I didn't want them to feel invisible in the rooms that should have been their home. At first, Horizon was just me. I rented a small office space tucked above a bakery. The paint was chipped, the ceiling leaked when it rained, but the walls held possibility. I bought 2 chairs, a second-hand desk, and a coffee maker that sputtered more than it brewed. On the window, I taped a piece of paper with 3 words written in bold black ink, "You are seen." The first veteran who walked through my door was a young woman named Alana. She had served in logistics overseas. When she came home, her family dismissed her work as clerical, never asking about the convoys she rode, the near misses with IEDs, the nights she cried into her pillow. "They think I did nothing," she whispered, eyes red. Sometimes I start to believe them. I listened. That's all I did at first. And when she was finished, I told her what I had needed to hear for years. "Your service matters, you matter, and no silence can erase that." Word spread slowly. A young Marine who slept in his truck came next, then an older Army nurse estranged from her children, then a quiet man from the Air Force whose parents had told him never to wear his uniform to family dinners. Each story carried its own weight, its own scar. But in the Horizon office, those scars became proof of survival, not shame. Do you know how powerful it is to hear your own story in someone else's voice? To realize you're not alone in the wounds you thought only you carried. That's what we built, brick by invisible brick, a place where silence lost its power. I began hosting weekly circles at the community center. Folding chairs in a circle, coffee in paper cups, a box of tissues on the table. At first, people sat stiffly, arms crossed, words locked inside. But one by one, voices rose. My father said I embarrassed him. My husband doesn't introduce me as a veteran. My family says I was gone too long to belong again. Each confession was like a match struck in darkness. One by one, they lit the room until no one sat in shadow anymore. And yes, I'll ask you, if you were in that circle, what story would you share? What silence would you break? Think about it, because speaking it, even in your own heart, is the first step to taking back your voice. Months passed. Horizon grew. Volunteers joined, some veterans, some civilians, all determined to be the family so many had lost. We set up mentorship programs, job workshops, quiet dinners where no one was erased from the table. Every time a new face walked in, I remembered that night in the reception hall, how one act of recognition had shifted everything. Horizon became my way of passing that recognition forward. Still, the past lingered. Some nights I dreamed of my mother's face, her silence cutting sharper than any blade. But I learned to let that silence fuel me rather than hollow me. Because here was the truth. My worth was never hers to grant or deny. My worth had been forged in deserts and battlefields, in scars and resilience, and now it was forged again in the laughter of veterans who finally felt seen. The moment that cemented it came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. The circle was small that night, just a handful of us in the community center basement. A young man named Jason sat hunched forward, his hands shaking. He had served only one tour, but his eyes carried centuries. "They don't even call me by my name anymore," he said, voice breaking. "To them, I'm just the kid who couldn't finish school. My mom says I wasted my life. My dad tells people I guard doors." He laughed, but it was hollow. "Sometimes I think they're right. Sometimes I think I'm nothing." The room went still. I recognized that pain. I had carried it in my own chest for years. I rose, crossed the circle, and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Hear me," I said, steady and clear. "They don't need to see you. We do. And we won't let you disappear. His eyes lifted, brimming with tears, and in that moment I saw myself years ago alone, erased, aching for someone to tell me I was still here. That was why Horizon existed. That was why I had chosen to turn pain into purpose. Because justice isn't only about the salute in the wedding hall. It's about every day after. It's about refusing to let silence write the last line of your story. So if you've listened this far, if any part of my story has echoed in your heart, I'll ask you gently, who in your life needs to hear those words, "You are seen"? Share this video with them. Leave a comment with their name, their story. Let's make this space the circle they never knew they had. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, stay with us, because Horizon isn't just my project. It's yours too. That night, when I locked the office and stepped into the cool air, I tilted my head back to the stars. Once, I had thought justice would come from apologies, from reconciliation forced at the family table. Now I knew better. Justice had come from standing up, from speaking truth, from building something that could not be erased. Silence had been my enemy, but now, silence had become the soil from which a new voice grew. Not just mine, but ours. The first challenge was money. Dreams don't pay rent, and my savings from the army didn't stretch far. I filled out grant applications late into the night, hunched over the second-hand desk in my apartment, the glow of the laptop burning my tired eyes. Some organizations dismissed me with form letters. Others wanted proof that Horizon could succeed before they would invest. But eventually, after weeks of rejections, a small Veterans Relief Fund offered us a seed grant, just enough to sign a lease on an office above the bakery on 5th Street. I still remember the day I opened that door for the first time. The paint peeled from the walls, the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and a cracked window let in a draft. Most people would have walked away, but to me, it was possibility. I rolled up my sleeves, bought paint with the last of the grant money, and spent a weekend coating the walls in a soft, steady blue. Friends donated an old filing cabinet, a mismatched couch, and a table that wobbled on one leg. I tightened the screws, stacked donated books on the shelves, and taped a sign to the front window in black marker, "Horizon Project." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "You are seen." Have you ever built something out of scraps, knowing that love, not perfection, was the real foundation? That's what those walls felt like. Share with me if you've ever taken something broken and made it into home. The veterans who came through our door in those early months each carried a story that cut to the bone. One was Marcus, a Marine who had survived 3 deployments only to return home to an empty house, his wife gone, his photos boxed up, divorce papers waiting on the table. She said she couldn't handle the silence. He told me, staring at the floor. I thought war was the hardest thing I'd ever face. Turns out it was coming home to nothing. Another was Sarah, a former Army medic. Her hands were steady, her record spotless. She had saved dozens of lives, but when she returned, her own parents dismissed her service. "You were just a nurse," they said, as if her years in combat hospitals were nothing more than playing doctor. She came into Horizon one evening with her arms crossed, daring me to tell her otherwise. Instead, I simply asked, "How many lives did you save?" She blinked at me, silent for a moment before whispering, "Too many to count." Marcus, Sarah, Jason, Alana, each story piled on another, bricks of pain and resilience. Horizon became the place where those bricks built something instead of burying someone. Our first real community event was a job workshop. We borrowed the basement of the library, lined it with folding tables, and invited local businesses. Only a handful showed up, but the room buzzed with energy as veterans polished resumes, practiced interviews, and for the first time, felt that their service was more than a line on paper. I watched Marcus shake hands with a small construction company owner who promised to call him the next week. When he left, his shoulders looked lighter. A month later, we organized a picnic at the local park. Veterans brought their children, their spouses, their service dogs. For once, the kids didn't feel like outsiders. They played tag, tossed frisbees, and roasted marshmallows while their parents laughed with people who understood them. I remember Sarah sitting on a picnic blanket, showing a little girl how to braid bracelets, her face soft in a way I hadn't seen before. These gatherings were small, messy, imperfect, but they mattered. Because in those moments, silence wasn't king anymore. Connection was. Do you know what that feels like, to watch someone's posture shift, their eyes brighten as they realize they belong? Tell me if you do, because those are the moments we live for at Horizon. As the months passed, Horizon grew beyond anything I had first imagined. We set up mentorship programs pairing veterans with local students. We started weekly dinners where no one sat at the far end of the table. And each time I looked around the room, I thought back to that wedding reception, the way Daniel's salute had cracked the silence wide open. I had taken that spark and carried it here, to light fires in the lives of others. One evening, at our 1-year anniversary, I stood at the front of the community hall. The room was full, veterans, families, volunteers, neighbors who had once walked past without seeing us. Balloons floated against the ceiling, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. I looked out at the crowd, at Marcus with his new fiancée, Sarah laughing with Alana, Jason helping a little boy build a toy plane, and I felt something in my chest unclench. I tapped the microphone, the hum drawing quiet. A year ago, Horizon was nothing more than a desk and a dream. I began. And now, look around you. This is what happens when silence is broken. This is what happens when we refuse to disappear. Faces turned toward me, eyes shining. I spoke from the marrow of my bones. Some of us came home to empty houses. Some came home to families who didn't understand. Some were told our service was nothing, our voices too loud, our scars inconvenient. But here, none of us are invisible. Here we are seen, we are family. Applause rose, not polite but powerful, rolling like thunder. I raised my glass, my voice steady. To every veteran who thought they were forgotten, this is your proof that you're not. To every silence that once defined us, this is the sound of it breaking. And to every future we will build together, this is the horizon we've claimed. The room erupted, and for the first time in years I felt wholly at peace. Not because my family had changed, not because the past had healed, but because we had created something new, something louder than silence, stronger than erasure. That night, as I locked the office door and looked out at the city lights, I whispered to myself, "This is just the beginning." That night, after the hall emptied and the laughter faded, I lingered alone in the quiet. The chairs were stacked, the balloons drifting low, but the echo of voices of veterans who had finally felt seen still filled the room. I stood in that silence, no longer crushed by it but carried by it, knowing it had become something new. And in that stillness, I realized this story was never just about one salute, one wedding, or even one project. It was about what those moments had taught me about how we rise. When I look back now, I don't see a wedding or a single salute as the end of my story. I see it as the beginning. Because that moment, when my brother stood and named me for who I truly was, reminded me of something we all forget too easily. Recognition is powerful, but it should never be conditional. Our worth is not defined by whether or not our families applaud us, or whether strangers understand us. It is defined by the way we keep standing, by the way we refuse to disappear. I think about Jason, Sarah, Marcus, Alana, and so many others who have walked through Horizon's doors. Each of them came in carrying silence. Each of them left carrying something else, hope. And that, in the end, is what matters most. So here's the truth I want to leave you with. Justice doesn't always come in the form of apologies or reconciliations. Sometimes, justice comes in the simple, defiant act of continuing to live, fully, loudly, unapologetically. True justice is not granted to us by others. True justice is born when we choose to rise, when we choose to carry light for those still lost in the dark. If you've listened all the way through, maybe you've seen pieces of yourself in this story. Maybe you've known what it feels like to be erased, to be overlooked, to be asked to behave when all you wanted was to be seen. If that's you, let me say this as clearly as I can: you are not invisible. You are not forgotten. Your scars, your struggles, your survival, they matter. They are proof of a life that refused to quit. And now I want to turn this to you. Who in your life needs to hear those words, "You are seen"? Share this video with them. Tell me their story in the comments. Because stories like ours aren't meant to be swallowed in silence. They're meant to echo, to remind others they're not alone. If this story spoke to you, I'd love for you to stay with me. Like the video if it resonated. Subscribe if you want to hear more. Not because I need numbers, but because every click, every voice here makes it harder for silence to win again. This channel, this community, is not just about my story. It's about ours. So let's keep going. Let's keep breaking the silence, one story at a time. Because the horizon is wide and there's room enough for all of us to rise.